It begins with a whisper carried by the wind through the pines of southern Virginia, a voice that speaks of a woman who buried every man she ever loved. They call her the widow of Esther Hollow, though her given name was Margaret Thorn. In 1878, her story haunted the small farming town like a sickness that spread through every rumor, every glance, every fearful silence at Sunday Mass. The town of Esther Hollow was little more than a handful of houses, a single dusty main road, and a church whose bell hadn't rung since the war. Men worked the land until their hands split open, and women prayed the soil would be kind enough to keep them fed through the winter. Life there was simple, except for the house on the hill where Margaret lived alone. Her home, once white-painted with a tidy porch, had grown grey and skeletal with age. Vines crawled up its face like veins, and in the mornings fog would wrap it like mourning cloth. Locals said the place belonged to death, and that Margaret had made peace with it long ago. No one knew what really happened to her first husband, Thomas. He went out to fell timber one afternoon and never came back. They said Margaret found his body 3 days later by the river, his axe buried in the mud beside him. The sheriff ruled it an accident, but some swore there was something in her face at the funeral, something unreadable, almost calm. After Thomas came Samuel, a merchant from Norfolk who met Margaret at the harvest fair 2 years later. He was charmed by her quiet grace, by her striking eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and sorrow. He built her a new fence and promised to fill the house with laughter again. But before the spring was done, Samuel too was dead. Fever, the doctor said. Yet those who cared to look closely noticed the marks on his neck, faint and oddly shaped, as though something had pressed against his skin too long. By the time her third husband, Elias Crane, moved into that lonely house, no one dared speak their suspicions aloud. They only watched and waited. The story spreads easily when people are afraid. In the tavern near the crossroads, men would whisper about the widow Thorn's garden. It bloomed longer than any other, even through the frost. Some said she mixed lye with the soil. Others said each flower marked a grave. The lantern light would flicker across their faces as they spoke, their voices shrinking when the wind moaned outside. Sheriff Wallace, a broad man with a limp from the war, had grown tired of the gossip. "There ain't a crime in burying bad luck," he told his deputy one morning. But something in the way he said it betrayed unease. Everyone had seen Margaret walking into town at dawn, her black dress fluttering like a ghost behind her, her face blank as stone. She came for flour, for salt, and sometimes for cloth, though no one ever saw her sew. Whenever anyone greeted her, she returned the gesture with quiet courtesy but little else. There was an emptiness about her, as though she were forever rehearsing solitude. It was early autumn when the stranger arrived, a young reporter named James Holloway, sent down from Richmond to write about the unsettled districts of the South. James carried a notebook and a hunger for stories that might sell. When an old man at the tavern told him about the widow Thorn, he smiled. "Every town's got its ghost," he said. But that night, when he looked toward the hill and saw the faint glow of a lamp swaying in Margaret's window, even he felt a prickle at the back of his neck. The next morning, he ridden up the hill under a pale sun, the earth damp with dew. The road turned to gravel, then to roots. The house loomed larger the closer he came, its windows reflecting nothing. When he knocked, a long silence followed before the door opened halfway. Margaret Thorn stood there, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes grey as morning fog. "Ma'am," he said, doffing his hat, "I'm writing a piece for the Herald. Some say you've had your share of troubles. I was hoping to hear it from you." Her gaze lingered on him, weighing something. Then she stepped aside. "If you're here for truth, Mr. Holloway," she said quietly, "you'll need to be patient. Truth takes its time." Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and earth. The furniture was old but spotless, the air colder than it should have been. On the mantel sat 3 framed daguerreotypes, 3 men, each somber, each staring somewhere just past the camera, as if unwilling to face it. Her tone never wavered as she spoke of them. Thomas, the steadfast farmer; Samuel, the dreamer; Elias, the kind one. She said their names the way a priest might read a list of the dead, without tears but not without prayer. James filled pages as she spoke, sketching in words the shadow of her life. But beneath her calm something churned. Now and then she paused to glance at the window, at the stretch of trees beyond the field, as though listening for a footstep she knew would never come. "You believe what they say about me," she said suddenly, eyes still fixed outside. The question caught him. "I believe stories are born from need," he answered. "And people need their fears explained." "That's clever," she said softly. "But it's not the same as truth." When he asked if she missed them, her husbands, she smiled for the first time. It was small, fleeting, and full of sadness. "I bury what's given to me," she replied. "The rest is between me and the earth." That evening, leaving her porch, James lingered a moment to glance back. She stood at the doorway watching him, the retreating light painting her in amber and shadow. She looked neither wicked nor tragic, just impossibly tired. Yet as he mounted his horse, he thought he saw something move near the side of the house, just a shift, a flicker among the ivy. But when he turned for a better look, the space was still again. Down in the valley, a bell began to toll. It hadn't sounded in months. James rode faster. The story of Margaret Thorn didn't end that day. It only deepened, like the soil after rain. And soon both James and the people of Esther Hollow would learn that some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig. The following morning, mist rolled down from the hills, curling around the fences and the broken gravestones that dotted the old churchyard. James Holloway woke early at Mrs. Linton's boarding house, the scratching of the crows outside his window serving as an unwelcome alarm. He couldn't shake the image of Margaret's house, the grey timbers, the framed faces of her husbands, and her voice, soft but filled with something unsaid. He had come to Esther Hollow expecting superstition and folklore, not the quiet complexity of a woman who carried grief like a ritual. He told himself it was all coincidence. Her string of dead husbands, the whispers, the symbols people stitched together in fear, but even his reporter's logic faltered as he recalled the way she had looked at him. As if she were waiting for him, though he could not say for what. After a quick breakfast of salt pork and stale bread, he stepped into the chilling morning air. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few farmers leading their mules and a child sweeping the steps of the general store. People watched him from the corners of their eyes. They had seen city men before, but none who stayed long. A stranger asking questions never stayed welcome for long. He found Sheriff Wallace outside the station, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a horse. The man's face was carved by years of dust and discipline. His uniform hung loose, as if he'd grown tired of filling it. "Morning, Sheriff," James called out. "I wanted to ask you about the Thorn place." Wallace didn't look up. "What about it?" "Well, the stories. About her husbands. Every account seems to differ. The knife in the sheriff's hand stilled. That's because rumors have more lives than cats," he said. "Thomas, Samuel, Elias, they all died, yes. But there's no crime without proof. And proof don't live long in Esther Hollow." James stepped closer. "You knew them?" "Thomas I knew. Good man. Worked hard, kept to himself. Samuel I met once or twice. Charmer but restless. Elias was quiet. Maybe too quiet." He glanced toward the distant hills where fog buried the horizon. Each of them died in their own time. Death don't need reason in these parts. "But you don't believe that," James said carefully. The sheriff's jaw worked as if chewing on something impossible to swallow. "I believe in peace. And Margaret's had none." He rose, slipping the small wooden horse into his pocket. "If you're writing your story, write it true. Whatever she's done or hasn't done, she's already paid for it." As the sheriff walked away, James noticed the limp, the dragging right foot that left uneven prints in the dust. The man carried his own ghost, that much was clear. By afternoon, the town seemed even quieter. He spent hours in the tavern, coaxing talk out of the older men who gathered there like moths around lamplight. One, a stonemason named Reuben, finally spoke. "She was already strange before Thomas died," Reuben said, rubbing the brim of his hat. "Wouldn't eat with the neighbors, wouldn't go to the socials. Always walking the riverbank alone. Some folks saw her digging there at night." "Digging?" James asked. Reuben nodded. "Said it was for her garden. But you tell me, mister, what kind of garden needs digging at midnight?" The men around the table murmured like a chorus. Stories spilled out, flowers that bloomed out of season, the sound of shovels under moonlight, the preacher's dog that vanished after barking near her property. James recorded everything, but as the evening crept closer, he felt none of it led to truth. Only more fragments of fear. Before sunset, he found himself again on the road to the Thorn house. He hadn't planned to return so soon, but curiosity has its own gravity. The path was damp from last night's rain, and the trees bent low, heavy with shadow. When he reached the gate, the same faint glow burned in an upstairs window. Margaret met him at the door before he could knock. "Mr. Holloway," she said, almost as though she had been expecting him. "You left your notebook yesterday." She held it out, his initials faintly pressed on the cover. He blinked, taking it. "I didn't even realize—" "I found it by the chair," she said. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes searched his. "Do you always return to your stories this quickly?" "Only when they follow me," he admitted. Her lips curved slightly, not quite into a smile. "Then come in. Supper's ready." Inside, the air was warmer, scented with roasted root vegetables. The small table was set for two. She ate little, instead watching him as he filled his plate. Outside, a storm began muttering beyond the hills. Rain tapped lightly on the windows. "I spoke with your sheriff today," James said cautiously. "He said you've known more grief than most." "That's one way of putting it," she said. "Though grief isn't something you know, it's something that knows you." He hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever feel they're still here?" She looked toward the empty chair beside her. "They never left." Lightning flashed, illuminating the framed portraits once more. And in that instant, James thought he saw, just for a breath, the faintest fog of condensation on the glass of one frame, as if someone inside had exhaled. He blinked and it was gone. He cleared his throat. "People in town speak of your garden. Say there's something unusual about it." "They would," she said, rising to pour tea. "People fear what grows without their permission." He followed her gaze toward the window. The storm had thickened into a sheet of rain. Beyond the glass, the garden looked alive in the lightning, rows of flowers shining wetly, their petals strange and pale beneath the flash. For a moment they seemed to shimmer silver. Suddenly a loud crack split the air. The lamps flickered, and the room plunged into half-dark. Margaret didn't move. "Power doesn't reach us here," she murmured. "When the storm comes, we wait it out." They sat in silence a long moment, the only sound the rain. Then softly she asked, "Do you have someone waiting for you, Mr. Holloway?" He shook his head. "No wife. No mother either." "I suppose the newspaper is all I've got." "Then you understand more than most," she said. "The loneliness of being buried alive." The words clung to him. When he finally left, the storm had worn itself to drizzle. He turned once more at the foot of the hill, watching her outline framed by candlelight. For a heartbeat she seemed surrounded by shapes, faint, human, impossibly close. But as he blinked against the rain, only shadows remained. Back in town, Mrs. Linton met him at the door, clutching a shawl. "You shouldn't be visiting that woman after dark," she warned. "My cousin used to work up there. Said things move on their own when the wind's quiet." James laughed softly. "You believe that?" "I believe what keeps me alive," she said, and before he could reply she shut the door. That night he dreamed of the garden, the flowers twisting, the soil breathing beneath them. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Margaret's voice, patient and low, "Truth takes its time." When dawn arrived, James found his notebook on the nightstand. He didn't remember leaving it there. And on the final page, in a delicate hand that wasn't his, was written 6 words. "They always come back for me." The morning broke clear after the storm, the fog retreating like a curtain drawn back to reveal a world washed clean. But James Holloway did not feel renewed. He sat at the small desk in his rented room, staring at the 6 words inked in his notebook. "They always come back for me." He tried to convince himself it was a prank, that he must have written it half asleep. Yet the handwriting was delicate, looping, and unmistakably a woman's. He closed the notebook, but those words clung to the inside of his skull like a whisper he couldn't unhear. He decided to visit the churchyard. Father Merrin, the parish priest, was said to have buried all 3 of the Thorn husbands. The church stood on a rise overlooking the town, its wooden steeple bent slightly to one side, like an old man leaning on a cane. James found the priest pruning wild rosemary near the fence, the air heavy with its bitter fragrance. "You're the reporter from Richmond," Merrin said without turning. His voice carried the fatigue of someone who had outlived too many funerals. "That's right," James replied. "I'm hoping you might tell me about the Thorn family." The shears stopped. The priest straightened slowly, his lined face pale under the morning sun. "That family has seen more graves than grace," he said. "What do you wish to know?" "Only what really happened." Merrin looked toward the distant hill where Margaret's home loomed grey. "What really happened?" he repeated softly. "Sometimes the truth is less forgiving than rumour." "Son?" He wiped his hands on his robe and motioned for James to follow. They walked among the graves until the priest stopped before 3 modest stones arranged side by side. Each bore a name: Thomas Thorn, 1865, Samuel Thorn, 1872, Elias Crane, 1876. The soil around them was darker than the others, damper even in the dry morning. "The earth doesn't breathe right near those stones," the priest said. "We reburied Thomas twice when rains washed his grave out. Same with Samuel. Even Elias's coffin sank wrong. I've seen the ground shift as though what's buried there refuses rest." James knelt, running a hand across the damp moss that crept up the edges of Elias's grave. He could feel a trace of chill through the soil, though the sun was already climbing. "You think she had a hand in their deaths?" Merrin hesitated before answering. "I think grief makes people strange. It binds them to things they do better to release." He sighed, his breath catching against the smell of wet earth. "You'll not find peace chasing her story." "None of us did," James looked up. "Then why does no one leave this town?" The priest smiled sadly. "Some places keep you as much as you keep them." As James walked back through the narrow streets, those words continued to echo. He found himself turning toward the hill once more, almost involuntarily. Against the pale sky, Margaret's house looked like a scar that refused to heal. That afternoon he went to the archives stored in the town hall's attic. Records were few, but he found a stack of yellowed church ledgers and death notices tied with twine. Each entry written in careful ink. The cause of death for Thomas: accident by drowning. For Samuel: fever of unknown origin. For Elias: heart failure. Nothing remarkable, except one consistent signature at the bottom of each page: Margaret Thorn, witness. A gust of wind rattled the windows then, making the candle tremble. He turned, half expecting to see someone there. But the room was empty. Only the faint creak of the rafters and the whisper of old paper. When he left the hall, evening had already spread across the valley. A violet sky settled over the fields. He carried the ledgers under his arm, determined to return them before midnight. But curiosity drew him once again toward the hill. He told himself it was for verification, for accuracy. The truth was simpler. He needed to see her. The path to the house wound through rows of brittle pines that whispered like a congregation at prayer. The light from the window was absent now. Only darkness breathed through the cracks in the shutters. He hesitated at the gate, unsure whether to knock. Then he heard it, faint at first, then clearer, a rhythmic thud from behind the house. Shovel to earth. He followed the sound around the corner, staying low. The moon hung wan and cold above him, throwing long silver bars through the trees. There, near the edge of the garden, he saw Margaret. Her dark dress moved almost soundlessly as she dug, the soil parting neatly at every stroke. She looked serene, purposeful, as if tending something sacred. James's breath caught when she dropped the shovel and knelt, pressing her bare hand into the fresh earth. She stayed like that a long moment, whispering words too soft to catch. He took one cautious step forward, and the branch beneath him cracked. Margaret's head turned sharply. Her eyes met his through the darkness. "Mr. Holloway," she said, not startled, not angry, only weary. "You should not be here." He stepped closer, the wet ground sucking at his boots. "What are you burying?" "The same thing I've always buried," she answered. "What refuses to stay still?" Lightning flashed on the horizon, illuminating the open pit beside her. Inside lay a single wooden box, small, unmarked. She reached to close it, but he caught her wrist. The touch startled them both. Her skin was cold. "Let me see," he said quietly. "For your story?" she asked. "For the truth." Something passed over her face then, something both tender and painful. She released his hand and stepped aside. James knelt, fingers trembling, and unlatched the box. Inside lay only wilted flowers bound with faded ribbons. Their petals were colorless, brittle as ash. At the bottom a ring glimmered faintly, silver engraved with initials EC. He looked up at her. "Elias Crane," she nodded. "He promised me forever. I promised him peace." The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain and earth. "Sayou said they never left." "They don't," she whispered. "The ground remembers every lie we tell it." Before he could answer, thunder cracked. She lifted the box and placed it back into the grave, her movements steady. "Go back to town, Mr. Holloway. Pretend you never came here." He stood frozen. "How you don't scare me." "I should," she said, not as a threat but as truth. She turned toward the house, her figure a dark silhouette against the lightning. He started after her, but something in the soil shifted beneath his feet, a hollow sound like breath released. Startled, he looked down. The ground around the fresh earth trembled, a faint ripple moving through it as if something deeper had exhaled. Then silence. When he looked up again, Margaret was at the porch watching him with something like sorrow. "Go before the rain starts," she said quietly. By the time he reached the bottom of the hill, the storm had broken again. Sheets of rain blurred the valley. He sprinted toward the town, heart hammering, his mind replaying every word, every glance. Elias Crane's ring still lay in his pocket. He couldn't remember placing it there, but it was there nonetheless. In his room, he locked the door, paced, sat, stood again. The candlelight quivered. From somewhere distant came the moan of thunder, and then beneath it another sound, a scrape, wood against wood. He turned slowly toward the closet. The noise came again, sharper now. He crossed the room, each step deliberate, until he stood before the door. Gently he opened it. Nothing. Only his coat, still damp from the rain. He laughed under his breath and rubbed his eyes. Exhaustion, that was all. Then he noticed the smell, the faint scent of earth, wet and sweet. On the floor of the closet, a small mound of soil had gathered, fresh and dark as the graves on the hill, and beneath it, half buried in the dirt, another object glinted, a second ring, marked with the initials ST. James Holloway didn't sleep. The night stretched long and gasping, filled with the restless ticking of his watch and the muted drip of rain from the eaves. The soil on his floor looked almost black in the candlelight, its edges damp and shining like blood in the dirt. And beside it the ring gleamed, a perfect circle of silver, marked with letters he already knew too well, St. Samuel Thorn. He crouched and lifted it carefully. The metal felt cold, impossibly cold, as though it had been buried deep for years. His heart pounded in wild rhythm, trying to keep pace with thought. It couldn't be real. It shouldn't be possible. He pressed his fingers against his temples, telling himself he must have picked it up unconsciously when rifling through the archives or wandering near the house. But even as he tried to reason it out, that small whisper of earth on his floor betrayed him. Something wasn't right. Something had followed him. At dawn he wrapped both rings in a handkerchief and slipped them into his coat pocket. Outside, the streets of Esther Hollow were slick from the night storm, the air humming with the smell of wet wood and chimney smoke. The few townspeople who passed him did not meet his eye. They had seen outsiders unravel before. The valley had that power over men. He walked straight to the sheriff's office. Wallace sat behind his desk, polishing the barrel of a rifle. When James entered, the older man didn't look surprised, only tired. "You look like the devil's been keeping you company," the sheriff said. "Maybe so," James replied. "I need to ask about Samuel Thorn." Wallace finally looked up. "What about him? Did you ever recover his ring when he died? Or anything belonging to him?" Wallace blinked slowly. "Why would you ask that?" James unwrapped the handkerchief and placed the silver ring on the desk. "Because this was in my room this morning. Buried under fresh soil." The sheriff didn't touch it. His eyes hardened. "That's a cruel trick to play." "I'm not playing games," James snapped. "That's real earth from the hill. I saw her digging last night. She has a box of keepsakes. Elias Crane's ring, ribbons, flowers. She buried them herself." Wallace pushed back his chair, standing. "You went up there after dark." "I had to. I needed answers." "Then you found more than you bargained for," Wallace said. "You think you're the first man to chase her secrets. She buries death, Mr. Holloway. Sometimes her own, sometimes other people's." James swallowed. "You mean—" "I mean that woman's heart died long before her hands ever did." The sheriff pocketed the ring without another word. "You want the full truth? Fine. Meet me by the gallows tree tonight, midnight. Why there? Because that's where this story began and where it'll finish if we're not careful." He left the office shaken. The gallows tree was a rotten oak on the edge of town, now half swallowed by ivy and weeds. The idea of meeting beneath its broken limbs at midnight filled him with unease, yet he knew he couldn't resist. Whatever hid behind the mask of the widow Thorn, he was already trapped in her orbit. Daylight crawled slowly across the valley. James spent it wandering near the church again, watching the birds scratch at the graves. He noticed for the first time that nothing grew near the thorn stones. No grass, no wildflowers. The soil remained bare, compacted, as though pressing down on something that wanted to rise. Father Merrin passed by, hat pulled low. "You've seen it now," the priest said quietly. "Some ground never forgets the hands that touched it." "Father," James asked, "do you think she's guilty?" Merrin hesitated. "Of killing?" "Perhaps not. Of binding herself to sorrow?" "Beyond doubt." As the sun dipped low, James returned to his room to gather his notebook. The smell of damp earth still lingered, faint but persistent. He opened the journal again, searching for clarity among the lines of his own words. Somewhere between the notes and the fragments of town folklore, he noticed new writing, thin, slanted, and again not his own. "You cannot carry their weight for me." He slammed the book shut. The memory of her eyes returned, steady, unafraid, endless. It wasn't guilt that haunted her. It was duty. When midnight neared, James wrapped his coat tightly and made for the gallows tree. The ground glistened from earlier drizzle, and a faint mist laced the air. Sheriff Wallace was already there, lantern in hand, his expression grim. "You kept your word," the sheriff said. "Good, maybe now you'll listen." "What did you mean earlier?" James asked. "That this is where it began." Wallace lifted the lantern. The light revealed the warped trunk of the tree, the splintered beam that had once held the rope. Elias Crane wasn't her first tragedy. Before any of them, there was Daniel Thorn, her brother. Fought for the Confederacy, hanged here after the war by Union men. She cut him down with her own hands. His voice softened. After that, she never touched another soul without losing them. James felt the weight of silence settle between them. "So you think she's cursed?" "I think she's marked by what she's seen," Wallace said. "You don't bury that kind of pain. You only plant it somewhere it can't grow." They stood without speaking as the wind crept colder. Somewhere in the dark, a nightjar cried. Wallace turned, meaning to leave, but his steps slowed. His eyes narrowed toward the distant hill. "Hell," he muttered. A faint orange glow had appeared near the Thorn house, flickering like fire. They hurried toward it, lanterns swinging wildly. The climb up the slope was steep and muddy, but the smell of smoke grew stronger with each step. When they reached the crest, the sight stopped them both. The garden blazed. Flames crawled over the flower beds, devouring the pale blossoms until they curled into ash. In the middle of it stood Margaret Thorn, motionless, her eyes reflecting the fire. "Margaret!" Wallace shouted. "What have you done?" She turned slowly, her face calm, illuminated in the drifting sparks. "It has to end," she said. "All of it." James stepped forward. "You'll burn the house." "Then let it burn. It's taken everything else." The flames roared higher, igniting the fence posts. Wallace tried to reach her, but James caught his arm. "Wait," he said. "Let her speak." Margaret looked at them for a long moment, hair whipping in the wind. "You think I killed them," she said quietly. "But I only kept them near. The world forgets too easily." "I couldn't let it forget them, too." The sheriff's voice broke through the roar. "You can't live with the dead, Margaret." "I never did," she answered. "They live with me." A gust of wind tore through the valley then, scattering sparks into the night. For an instant, the fire dimmed, revealing something on the ground where the flowers had been. A circle of small stones, each engraved with initials, DT, TT, ST, EC, 4 graves. Perfectly arranged. Margaret sank to her knees inside that circle. "Now they can rest," she whispered. "Now so can I." She lifted something from her pocket, the 2 rings James recognized. Before either man could reach her, she pressed them into the dirt. The fire flared again, swallowing the shadows. When it died down moments later, the garden was still. The smoke drifted low over blackened soil. Margaret Thorn lay beside the ashes, her face serene, one hand buried in the earth. There was no pain written anywhere, only finality. James knelt beside her, the heat of the embers warming his face. He wanted to speak, to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. Wallace removed his hat and bowed his head. When they finally carried her body to the churchyard, dawn was breaking over Esther Hollow. The priest waited silently at the gate. James kept his distance, watching as the coffin disappeared into the same ground that had held all her husbands. The earth accepted her gently, without protest. As the first light touched the hill, James felt a tremor beneath his feet, only a faint shift, like an exhale. The ground was breathing again, but this time it sounded almost like relief. The town woke slowly the morning after the fire. The valley wore a haze of smoke that curled through the pines and drifted across the rooftops like a shroud. From the porch of the boarding house, James Holloway watched as dark flecks of ash fell over Esther Hollow, settling on fences, horses, and the heads of people who spoke in whispers. No one worked the fields that day. They only stared toward the hill, where the widow Thorn's house stood charred and silent. Father Merrin held a short service at sunrise. Nearly the entire town gathered, heads bowed, though few claimed to have truly known the woman they were burying. Margaret Thorn became what she had always been, an empty place people filled with stories to explain what they feared. And now with her gone, those stories thickened into legend. Some said the fire had been divine mercy. Others claimed the earth itself had demanded her. James stood apart as the priest spoke his final words. He had promised himself he'd remain in Esther Hollow until he finished his story, but now that the widow was gone, he wasn't sure what remained to tell. The truth, perhaps, but the truth felt incomplete. The garden, the rings, the graves, they all pointed towards something deeper, something that refused to die even when the flames had. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that Margaret's last words weren't a confession. They were a warning. After the burial, Sheriff Wallace approached him. His uniform smelled faintly of smoke and cedar oil. "She's at peace now," the sheriff said, though the words came out uncertain. "Maybe the rest of us can be too." James looked toward the hill. "You ever think peace isn't what she wanted?" Wallace gave him a long look. "You've got a strange way of seeing things, son. The dead don't want, they rest." "Maybe," James said. "But that hill, does it look like it knows how to rest?" The sheriff followed his gaze. Thin threads of smoke still rose from the ruins, twisting lazily into the morning sky. "If you're wise," he said, "you'll leave this place before it remembers you." He left after that, taking his horse north along the old river road. James stayed behind, unable to quiet the storm in his chest. Everywhere he turned, he heard the echoes of Margaret's voice. He opened his notebook, its cover now dirty and warped from rain, and read the final passage she had written. "They always come back for me." She hadn't meant the dead, he realized. She'd meant the living, the men drawn to her house, to her sadness, to her silence. Every one of them searching for something they couldn't name, and finding instead a mirror of their own despair. In her they saw what they feared most, to be forgotten. By noon he found himself climbing the hill again. The air there was hotter, thick with the sweet rot of burned wood. The remains of the house stood blackened and hollow, beams jutting from the ground like broken ribs. The garden was gone, only smouldering soil left behind. He stepped carefully through the ashes, listening to the crunch beneath his boots. Near the center where she had lain, he noticed something glinting, half-buried. He knelt and brushed away the soot. A ring, no initials this time, just a plain silver band. He turned it over in his fingers. The metal still warm, as though retaining her touch. Instinct told him to leave it, but curiosity was stronger. He slid it into his pocket. That night he stayed awake writing by candlelight. The words came slower than before. He wasn't describing anymore. He was remembering. Every line seemed to carry her voice between the letters. The sound of her silence filled the space around him, until he began to believe she might still be there, just out of sight. Sometime past midnight, the candle flickered, guttered, then flared. A draft swept through the room, though the window was closed. James looked up, every nerve alive. The air smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. He swallowed hard. "Margaret!" he whispered. The flame steadied. Silence. He almost laughed at himself, but then he saw the notebook, the pages turning slowly, one by one, as if guided by wind, though none moved in the room. They stopped at the last entry, his handwriting trailing mid-sentence. Below it new words appeared, curling delicately, as if written by an unseen hand. "You write because you remember. Remember because you must," he froze. The ink gleamed wet, fresh. The candle flame leaned toward the page, casting shadows of letters that seemed to move. He could feel his heartbeat thrumming in his ears, could almost hear her voice layered beneath it. The next lines formed before his eyes. "I buried what others feared to love. Now you will keep their stories for me." The candle went out, darkness swallowed the room. He sat motionless, listening to the faint hiss of cooling wax. When he finally struck a match, the air felt heavier, like the room had shrunk around him. The notebook remained open, but the words were gone. Only clean paper stared back, By dawn he couldn't stay any longer. He packed his things, leaving payment on the dresser. As he stepped outside, he noticed the ground near the boarding house porch. Soft mud, recently disturbed. A small circle pressed into it where something round had been. He reached into his pocket, half expecting the ring to be gone. It was still there. Cold now, but real. He mounted his horse and started down the main road. The town watched quietly as he passed, their faces pinched with something between pity and relief. At the edge of Esther Hollow he slowed, looking back one last time at the hill that had swallowed so many. The morning sun cut through the mist, touching the scorched ridge with faint gold. For an instant, he thought he saw her there, standing among the ashes, her black dress stirring in the wind. Then the light shifted, and the shape was gone. He rode until the town disappeared behind the trees and the valley flattened into open country. But even miles away, the earth still smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, and every turn of the road seemed to whisper the same quiet plea that had filled his notebook. Remember because you must. And he did. Long after the fields of Virginia faded behind him, after his words had filled columns in the Richmond Herald, after the townspeople's names turned to dust, James Holloway carried her story. He kept their rings in a small wooden box and never married. Some said he lost his mind. Others said he wrote the most beautiful account of grief ever printed. But those who read his work closely noticed something strange. Each copy of the paper carried beside his byline a faint mark, almost like a watermark pressed into the paper, 3 tiny letters barely visible, MT, her initials. The widow who buried every man she loved, and one of them perhaps who never stopped writing her back. More than 50 years passed before anyone spoke the name Esther Hollow in Richmond again. Time does its best to bury stories, but some refuse to stay quiet. It was the winter of 1931, when a young archivist named Clara Weston found herself assigned to the dusty basement of the Herald's old headquarters. Her task was simple: organize forgotten manuscripts and correspondences from the 19th century. She had no idea that among the yellowing papers, she'd find something that would change the way she dreamed. The box was marked only with initials. J.H. inside were brittle pages bound by cotton string, a notebook warped with age, and at the bottom, a small tarnished ring. The metal was dull, yet when her fingers brushed it, a faint warmth pulsed through it as if something within still lived. She turned the first page of the notebook, careful not to tear it. The title, written in faded ink, read, "The Hollow Earth." At first she assumed it to be fiction, a strange Gothic relic from some forgotten columnist. The handwriting was elegant but uneven, frantic in places. The opening lines stopped her cold. There are graves the rain will not seal. There are names the earth keeps breathing back. She felt an unease bloom low in her stomach, though she couldn't say why. Over the next week, Clara read every word of Holloway's account. The widow, the hill, the fire, each detail felt less like invention and more like memory captured at the edge of madness. The story unfolded in his precise, weary tone, yet between the sentences she sensed another voice, lighter, sharper, a counterpoint whispering from beneath the ink. Sometimes it spoke in the margins, faint pencil sketches that hadn't belonged to the author. She waits by the orchard, or he never left. Clara began staying later at the archives, drawn into the past as though it recognized her. The other clerks teased her gently for her obsession, but none would join her in the basement after dusk. It wasn't superstition exactly. It was instinct. They said the air down there smelled strange, a mix of lavender and damp soil. One evening, as wind rattled the old windows above, Clara noticed something new. Between Holloway's pages, a folded letter she hadn't seen before. It bore the imprint of the Richmond Herald, dated April 1887, 5 years after his last known article. There was no address, only a single sentence written across the middle in hurried script. The ground still remembers. No signature, no explanation. But faint smudges of dried mud framed the corners of the page. She stayed long past closing that night, reading by the sickly glow of a single bulb. As she turned another page, a pressed flower slipped loose, a brittle sprig of lavender impossibly preserved. The smell filled the air, soft but unmistakable. She exhaled shakily, feeling as if the room itself were watching her. The radiators hissed. The floorboards creaked. Then something impossible happened. For a brief instant, The words on the page blurred and reformed, not fading but changing. It lasted no more than a second, but she saw them, new lines, freshly written, curling across the paper in real time. "You've come far, Clara. Don't stop now." Her throat closed. She dropped the book, backing away. The fluorescent bulb flickered, then steadied. The room was utterly silent again. Heart hammering, she crouched to pick up the notebook. The message had vanished, leaving only Holloway's last entry. "The ground remembers what love forgets." She packed her things in haste, but even after locking the archive door, she couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. That night, she dreamed of the hill, the blackened soil breathing faintly under a violet sky, and a woman in a long dress standing among rows of shining flowers. She didn't speak, but her eyes were the color of rain. In the days that followed, Clara's obsession deepened. She searched parish records, land deeds, anything referencing Esther Hollow. The town had disappeared from maps after 1902, erased by a massive flood that rerouted the river. Only stray mentions remained: supply shipments, flood relief lists, and one personal letter from Father Merrin, dated 1883. "I fear the valley won't hold." The ground softens every year. It's as if something beneath stirs for freedom. Clara typed every document, cataloguing them into neat folders. But her sleep worsened. Each night brought the lavender scent again, drifting through her apartment like memory. Sometimes she woke to the faint sound of digging, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere below her floorboards. And once, when she turned on her bedside lamp, she found a smear of soil across her pillowcase. She told herself she must have brought it home from the archive. That explanation felt safe, until she noticed the ring she had pocketed was gone. On the morning she decided to return the notebook to storage, she discovered a small package waiting at her desk. No postage, no sender. Inside, the ring clean and gleaming, its surface freshly polished. Beneath it lay a slip of paper in flowing handwriting she recognized immediately from the notebook margins. "If the ground remembers, so must you." The air in the office seemed to tighten. She folded the note quickly, heart racing. Around her, the other archivists worked in their usual monotony. None noticed her pale face, the trembling of her hands. By evening, she was on a train to South Virginia with the notebook and ring wrapped in a scarf. The landscape turned strange as she neared the valley. The hills gathered closer, green giving way to grey. By the time she stepped off at the nearest station, rain had begun. Locals, she asked, only shook their heads when she mentioned Esther Hollow. "That land's been underwater for decades," one old man said. "A reservoir now. Nothing left but mud." But Clara didn't believe that. She followed the road west, boots sinking into soft ground as the rain worsened. The air smelled familiar, damp, rich, strangely sweet. And then she saw it. Through the fog, the faint rise of a hill above the flooded plain. Real, unforgiven, waiting. She climbed slowly, her coat plastered to her body. At the summit, she found wildflowers blooming despite the rain, lavender pale and trembling in the wind. Kneeling, she pressed the ring into the soil. For a heartbeat, the ground pulsed beneath her palm, warm and alive. A whisper came then, gentle and distant. Not frightening, but inevitable. "Thank you." When she opened her eyes again, the rain had stopped. The hill was still. In the distance, thunder rolled across an empty valley. Weeks later, a fisherman reported seeing a lone woman standing above the reservoir at dusk, her hair shining like silver in the light. When he looked again, she was gone. Only ripples remained where the water met the shore. And though Clara Weston never returned to Richmond, every year a single envelope arrived at the Herald's archives, always smelling faintly of lavender. Inside, a short note written in the same looping hand. "The ground remembers." By the time another 30 years had passed, Esther Hollow existed only in rumor and archive. The reservoir that replaced it gleamed between the ridges like a sheet of glass, still and dark, hiding whatever stories had been buried there. The locals called it Thorn Lake, though few knew why. The name had been on the original surveyor's maps from decades before, carried forward without question. No one alive remembered the town that slept beneath those waters. But in the summer of 1962, during a drought that drained half the reservoir, the past rose again. It began when a state hydrologist named Robert Crane arrived to inspect the exposed lakebed. He was not a man given to superstition. His world was measurements, soil samples, and rainfall data. Yet the work unsettled him from the first day. The ground beneath the waterline was strangely uneven, rippled like something once alive. In one dry channel, he found remnants of a gatepost, charred wood protruding from clay. The name carved into it was faint but legible: Thorn. That evening, back at the temporary camp, Crane studied the old blueprints sent from Richmond. The papers were stained and incomplete, handwritten notations in the margins. Near the top was a date, 1878. The initials beside it made him pause, J.H. He would not know until later that these were from James Holloway, a journalist forgotten by time but not, it seemed, by the land. The next morning, workers uncovered remnants of stone foundations near the center of the drained basin. What might have been a road emerged first, then warped wooden beams, then something else: graves. 6 of them arranged in a neat semicircle, their markers almost completely dissolved. One remained partially intact. Its engraved letters were shallow but distinct when the rainfall washed away the silt. As the crew fell silent, one man laughed nervously, muttering about the widow and old wives' tales. Crane dismissed the talk, but even he felt the strange hush that followed. When the sun fell behind the hills, no one wanted to stay near the site. That night he dreamed of lavender fields bending under a storm. A woman in black stood among them, her face hidden, her voice soft and near. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. His tent smelled faintly of soil and smoke. By noon, reports began to spread that the reservoir level was falling faster than expected. The engineers found no break in the dam, no leaking valves. It was as if the water itself was being drawn down. Crane returned to the site, measuring the drop. That was when he noticed the soil pattern had changed. Where their boots had sunk the day before, the ground now bulged upward, tiny ridges like the imprint of hands pressing from below. He knelt to touch it. The moment his fingertips met the surface, warmth pulsed against his skin. Startled, he pulled back. "Geothermal," he whispered to himself, though the air around him was cool. And then he saw it, a thin silver ring half buried in the mud. He wiped it clean. There were no initials this time, no rust, no tarnish. It gleamed as though newly forged. That evening, Crane visited the county office to cross-check burial records. Nothing. No mention of a cemetery in that location. But the clerk, an elderly woman who'd lived in those hills all her life, recognized the name immediately. "Thorn Hill?" she asked. "Oh, Lord, my grandmother used to tell stories about that place. Said the earth there still breathes." Crane laughed politely, though it settled uneasily in his chest. "Breathes?" She said the ground would move in its sleep. Whole trees would tilt over by morning. "My granddaddy used to swear you could hear voices after a storm." The old woman leaned close. "You don't dig there, mister. Some graves don't take kindly to it." He thanked her and left with the ring still in his pocket. That night, unable to resist, he returned alone to the drained basin. The moon hung low, turning the exposed mud into dull silver. He walked until he reached the semicircle of graves. The air was utterly still. He knelt by the marked stone, MT, and placed his hand over it. "Who were you?" he murmured. The ground warmed beneath his palm. Then, beneath his fingertips, the mud trembled. He jerked back, stumbling. For a second, he thought he saw movement, a shape forming just below the surface, something smooth and pale, hands not bone but flesh. They pressed upward once, then vanished as cracks spread outward across the earth. A rush of water erupted through the fissures, pouring from nowhere, filling the basin fast. Crane turned to run. The ground gave way beneath him, dragging his boots deep into sucking mud. Water surged past his knees, dark and cold, rising faster with every breath. He clawed upward, reaching the incline just as the flood swallowed the graves. At dawn, the reservoir had regained its former level, as if the drought had never happened. The foreman found Crane's camp empty, except for his notes and the silver ring resting neatly atop them. Weeks later, the state declared the investigation complete. Official paperwork listed the drowning as accidental. But the workers told a different story, that the lake had risen in a single night without rainfall, and that since then it never dropped again, no matter the season. In Richmond, the report was filed away with the others, lost among bureaucratic clutter. But inside the folder, clipped behind the final page, was a handwritten letter addressed to whoever might open it next. To the one who finds this. The ground beneath Thorn Lake is not dead. I've seen it breathe. I've felt its pulse. I don't know what it wants, only that it remembers every name, every promise, every betrayal left upon it. And it has not finished speaking. If you go there, bring nothing of silver. It listens through the metal. R.C. Over the following years, residents near the reservoir noticed strange things. Lilac-colored blooms appeared along the shoreline each spring, though no one ever planted them. During dry summers, faint whispers echoed across the water, rising and falling with the wind. Campers claimed to wake at night smelling lavender, despite the absence of flowers. By the 1970s, the lake became off-limits due to a series of unexplained accidents. Boats capsized in calm weather. Divers vanished without trace. Officials blamed shifting currents. Locals whispered another name altogether, the widow's breath, and sometimes, on mist-heavy mornings, fishermen swore they could see a figure standing knee-deep in the shallows, her dark dress rippling in the water, her head bowed as though listening. They said she wasn't a ghost, but something older, something patient. Each time they looked again, the figure was gone, and in her place only circles rippling outward, faint and endless across the surface of Thorn Lake, a reminder that even buried memories will rise again, so long as the earth remembers their names. By the time another 30 years had passed, Esther Hollow existed only in rumor and archive. The reservoir that replaced it gleamed between the ridges like a sheet of glass, still and dark, hiding whatever stories had been buried there. The locals called it Thorn Lake, though few knew why. The name had been on the original surveyor's maps from decades before, carried forward without question. No one alive remembered the town that slept beneath those waters, but in the summer of 1962, during a drought that drained half the reservoir, the past rose again. It began when a state hydrologist named Robert Crane arrived to inspect the exposed lakebed. He was not a man given to superstition. His world was measurements, soil samples, and rainfall data. Yet the work unsettled him from the first day. The ground beneath the waterline was strangely uneven, rippled like something once alive. In one dry channel, he found remnants of a gatepost, charred wood protruding from clay. The name carved into it was faint but legible: Thorn. That evening, back at the temporary camp, Crane studied the old blueprint sent from Richmond. The papers were stained and incomplete, handwritten notations in the margins. Near the top was a date, 1878. The initials beside it made him pause, J.H. He would not know until later that these were from James Holloway, a journalist forgotten by time but not, it seemed, by the land. The next morning, workers uncovered remnants of stone foundations near the center of the drained basin. What might have been a road emerged first, then warped wooden beams, then something else: graves. 6 of them arranged in a neat semicircle, their markers almost completely dissolved. One remained partially intact. Its engraved letters were shallow but distinct when the rainfall washed away the silt. As the crew fell silent, one man laughed nervously, muttering about the widow and old wives' tales. Crane dismissed the talk, but even he felt the strange hush that followed. When the sun fell behind the hills, no one wanted to stay near the site. That night he dreamed of lavender fields bending under a storm. A woman in black stood among them, her face hidden, her voice soft and near. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. His tent smelled faintly of soil and smoke. By noon, reports began to spread that the reservoir level was falling faster than expected. The engineers found no break in the dam, no leaking valves. It was as if the water itself was being drawn down. Crane returned to the site, measuring the drop. That was when he noticed the soil pattern had changed. Where their boots had sunk the day before, the ground now bulged upward, tiny ridges like the imprint of hands pressing from below. He knelt to touch it. The moment his fingertips met the surface, warmth pulsed against his skin. Startled, he pulled back. "Geothermal," he whispered to himself, though the air around him was cool. And then he saw it, a thin silver ring half buried in the mud. He wiped it clean. There were no initials this time, no rust, no tarnish. It gleamed as though newly forged. That evening, Crane visited the county office to cross-check burial records. Nothing. No mention of a cemetery in that location. But the clerk, an elderly woman who'd lived in those hills all her life, recognized the name immediately. "Thorn Hill?" she asked. "Oh, Lord, my grandmother used to tell stories about that place. Said the earth there still breathes." Crane laughed politely, though it settled uneasily in his chest. "Breathes?" She said the ground would move in its sleep. Whole trees would tilt over by morning. My granddaddy used to swear you could hear voices after a storm. The old woman leaned close. You don't dig there, mister. Some graves don't take kindly to it. He thanked her and left with the ring still in his pocket. That night, unable to resist, he returned alone to the drained basin. The moon hung low, turning the exposed mud into dull silver. He walked until he reached the semicircle of graves. The air was utterly still. He knelt by the marked stone, empty, and placed his hand over it. Who were you? He murmured. The ground warmed beneath his palm. Then, beneath his fingertips, the mud trembled. He jerked back, stumbling. For a second, he thought he saw movement, a shape forming just below the surface, something smooth and pale, hands not bone but flesh. They pressed upward once, then vanished as cracks spread outward across the earth. A rush of water erupted through the fissures, pouring from nowhere, filling the basin fast. Crane turned to run. The ground gave way beneath him, dragging his boots deep into sucking mud. Water surged past his knees, dark and cold, rising faster with every breath. He clawed upward, reaching the incline just as the flood swallowed the graves. At dawn, the reservoir had regained its former level, as if the drought had never happened. The foreman found Crane's camp empty, except for his notes and the silver ring resting neatly atop them. Weeks later, the state declared the investigation complete. Official paperwork listed the drowning as accidental. But the workers told a different story, that the lake had risen in a single night without rainfall, and that since then it never dropped again, no matter the season. In Richmond, the report was filed away with the others, lost among bureaucratic clutter. But inside the folder, clipped behind the final page, was a handwritten letter addressed to whoever might open it next. To the one who finds this. The ground beneath Thorn Lake is not dead. I've seen it breathe. I've felt its pulse. I don't know what it wants, only that it remembers every name, every promise, every betrayal left upon it. And it has not finished speaking. If you go there, bring nothing of silver. It listens through the metal. R.C. Over the following years, residents near the reservoir noticed strange things. Lilac-colored blooms appeared along the shoreline each spring, though no one ever planted them. During dry summers, faint whispers echoed across the water, rising and falling with the wind. Campers claimed to wake at night smelling lavender, despite the absence of flowers. By the 1970s, the lake became off-limits due to a series of unexplained accidents. Boats capsized in calm weather. Divers vanished without trace. Officials blamed shifting currents. Locals whispered another name altogether, the widow's breath, and sometimes, on mist-heavy mornings, fishermen swore they could see a figure standing knee-deep in the shallows, her dark dress rippling in the water, her head bowed as though listening. They said she wasn't a ghost, but something older, something patient. Each time they looked again, the figure was gone, and in her place only circles rippling outward, faint and endless across the surface of Thorn Lake, a reminder that even buried memories will rise again, so long as the earth remembers their names. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.